In this video, we will talk about what Middle Ages people eat and how did it taste. Please subscribe. As dawn breaks over the rolling English countryside, a blanket of fog still clings to the green fields. The air is cool and smells faintly of damp earth and wood smoke. You're standing just outside a thatched cottage, its timber beams weathered by time and the seasons. The small wooden door creaks slightly open, and the scent of simmering oats gently greets your nose. Thick, hearty, and slightly nutty. Welcome to the early Middle Ages, a world where meals were more than just food. They were rituals shaped by harvests, feasts, fasts, and faith prepared with patience, served with reverence, and shared with gratitude. Inside the cottage, a woman stirs a heavy iron pot over a low fire. She hums a tune passed down from her grandmother. Her sleeves are rolled to her elbows, and the hem of her rough woolen dress is singed slightly from years of fireside cooking. On the hearth, porridge bubbles slowly, made from barley or oats soaked overnight. The texture is thick like wet clay. She adds a pinch of salt, a drizzle of honey if the bees have been kind this season, and maybe, just maybe, a few dried crabapple from the pantry shelf. A young boy stirs from his straw mattress in the corner. He rubs his eyes and watches his mother work. This breakfast, bland by today's standards, is warm, sustaining, and a luxury to those who've seen hard winters. Red Apple, what was breakfast like? In most peasant homes, breakfast was not a grand event. It was often a simple bowl of gruel or pottage. Gruel was a thin porridge made from grains boiled in water or milk, if milk was available. Pottage was thicker, sometimes including beans, leeks, cabbage, or onions. This early morning meal was practical and easy to prepare. It was warm, filling, and reused ingredient from the day before. Sometimes, if the family owned a hen or two, an egg might be cracked into the pot for protein. On rare occasions, a slice of coarse brown bread, made from rye or barley. The church played a vital role in dictating what could and couldn't be eaten. Certain days were fasting days. Others were feast days. On fast days, which could number more than 100 a year, meat was forbidden, and fish became the star of the table. This would continue throughout the Middle Ages. The idea was that fasting was a spiritual discipline, cleansing the soul as much as the body. But the wealthy? They found loopholes. Beavers, for example, were considered fish by some bishops because they lived in water. So on fast days, noblemen might dine on roast beaver tail with herbs and sauce. Peasant versus noble diets. Imagine for a moment you're not in the peasant's home, but standing in a stone manor hall. The fire roars beneath a large stone hearth. The smell is different here, richer, more complex. A boar's head stuffed with garlic roasts on a spit. Pastries shaped like birds and beasts are lined up on long oak tables. Jugs of sweetened wine sit beside loaves of white manchet bread, soft, fine, and only for the wealthy. The contrast is startling. Peasants dined on barley, nobles on wheat. Peasants drank ale. Nobles sipped imported wine or mead. Where one had turnips and beans, the other had swan and saffron sauce. And yet, both shared something universal: hunger, gratitude, and community. Spices and surprises. But how did it taste? Well, medieval food didn't lack flavor, just predictability. If you were wealthy, your food was often drenched in spices like cinnamon, cloves, pepper, saffron, and nutmeg. Why? Not just for taste. Spices were expensive, exotic, and showed off status. For the poor, flavor came from onions, leeks, mustard seeds, or garlic. Sometimes herbs, sage, parsley, or dill, grew wild and were foraged. These plants added brightness to otherwise dull stews. And salt, precious salt, preserved meat and fish for long winters. Fields of flavor, from soil to supper. Let us drift now, dear listener, away from the smoky hearth and into the fresh, open fields of a medieval village. The air is laced with the aroma of damp grass, the musky scent of freshly turned soil, and the unmistakable fragrance of livestock, earthy and real. A peasant farmer trudges through the furrows with bare, calloused feet. The land is heavy with dew, the morning sun still low behind the trees. A wooden plow creaks as it pulls through the ground, guided by a pair of slow, obedient oxen. The cycle of medieval food begins here, in the dirt, with sweat and prayer. Grains are the backbone of the medieval diet. Wheat, oats, barley, rye, each playing a different role depending on who you were and what you could afford. Wheat made the finest bread, light and white. But peasants, they were lucky to get bread made of rye or barley, often dark, chewy, and sour. In hard times, it might be mixed with acorns or ground beans. Bread, the staff of life. In medieval times, bread wasn't just a food, it was a way of life. It made up 70 to 80% of a typical peasant's daily caloric intake, and it came in many forms. A round barley loaf with a hard crust, flat oat cakes baked on stones near the hearth, and for the nobles, soft manchet loaves, baked white, fluffy, sifted, refined. Bakers were vital in town life, often regulated strictly. In fact, some towns passed laws to punish bakers who made underweight loaves. Bread was so essential that during famines, towns would grind anything they could into flour, including peas, lentils, tree bark, and yes, even ground bones. Foraging and the forest. But beyond fields and mills lay another pantry, the forest. Here, women and children foraged for wild herbs, mushrooms, nuts, and berries. These were nature's free gifts, flavor, medicine, and sustenance all in one. Hazelnuts and chestnuts were crushed and stirred into stews. Nettles, sorrel, and wild garlic added tang to pottage. Mushrooms, when correctly identified, gave texture to otherwise soft meals. The forest was both feared and treasured, a place of myth, but also necessity. And then there were honeybees, those tiny golden alchemists of sweetness. Honey was the primary sweetener before sugar became common. It flavored Alash, preserved fruits, and glazed meats at noble tables. Dairy, from udder to table. If your family owned a cow, and that was a rare luxury, fresh milk was a treasure. But it didn't last long, and refrigeration didn't exist. So milk was turned into butter, soft cheeses, and sometimes buttermilk. These were not creamy brie wheels or sharp cheddars. No, medieval cheese was often sour, salty, and coarse. In monasteries, monks perfected cheese-making, creating early recipes that would one day evolve into Europe's famed cheeses. In villages, butter was made in small batches, churned by hand in wooden barrels, thick, pale, and slightly tangy. And if the cow was dry, goat milk might be the next best thing. Cooking without kitchens. Most medieval homes had no formal kitchen. Instead, cooking happened on an open hearth, a sunken pit with stones or iron grates over the flame. Iron pots hung from hooks. Flatbreads were baked on stones. Soups simmered slowly all day. There were no timers, no recipes. Everything was done by feel, by memory passed through generations. And if your home had no fire, you might take your dough to the communal oven, the village bakehouse where neighbors gathered and shared space. It was there that stories were swapped, herbs were traded, and the village pulse was felt most. Cooking without kitchens. Most medieval homes had no formal kitchen. Instead, cooking happened on an open hearth, a sunken pit with stones or iron grates over the flame. Iron pots hung from hooks. Flatbreads were baked on stones. Soups simmered slowly all day. There were no timers, no recipes. Everything was done by feel, by memory passed through generations. And if your home had no fire, you might take your dough to the communal oven, the village bakehouse where neighbors gathered and shared space. It was there that stories were swapped, herbs were traded, and the village pulse was felt most. Pottage, pans, and peasant suppers. Imagine yourself now, seated on a small wooden stool inside a humble, smoky cottage. The air is thick with the smell of boiling grains and dried herbs. A blackened iron cauldron swings gently above the hearth flame, and inside it, the meal of the day simmers slowly. Pottage. Pottage was the heart of the medieval peasant table, a thick stew made from whatever one had. Barley, oats, or millet formed the base. Into this went root vegetables, wild herbs, bits of old bread, and sometimes a splash of ale to thicken. It was filling, flexible, and forgiving. A dish that welcomed scraps, forgave forgetfulness, and absorbed flavor like a sponge. Vegetables, humble and hearty. Vegetables in the Middle Ages were not sides. They were centerpieces. Turnips, onions, cabbage, leeks, and carrots, often purple or white, filled every pot. Lentils and beans were crucial sources of protein for those who couldn't afford meat. Cabbage stewed with vinegar. Onions roasted in ash. Carrots simmered into mush with herbs. Garlic and leeks added bold flavor. And in spring, fresh green peas were a special treat. And no, tomatoes, potatoes, and corn? Those didn't arrive until the Columbian Exchange, centuries later. Medieval veggies were earthy, simple, and seasonal, eaten fresh when possible, dried or pickled when not. Fish for the faithful. Now let us walk beside the riverbanks or step into the cool stone cellar of a monastery. Fish, oh yes, fish played a crucial role, especially due to religious fasting. The church required abstention from meat on many days, especially Fridays in Lent. So, fish became a spiritual food and a practical one. River fish like eels, pike, and carp were caught in woven traps. In coastal towns, herring and cod were salted or smoked and traded widely. Monks even built elaborate fish ponds to raise carp. Fish farming before the term existed. And for wealthier tables, shellfish like oysters or mussels might make an appearance, stewed in herbs or served cold with vinegar. Cooking tools, primitive but practical. In a medieval kitchen, tools were few, but every item told a story. The iron pot was prized, passed through generations, seasoned with every stew. Wooden spoons, clay bowls, woven baskets, and iron knives were common. Griddles for flatbreads, spits for turning meat, and heavy mortars for grinding spices. Herbs and grains were crushed with care, sometimes with stones on a slab. Cooking was slow, methodical, and deliberate, an art shaped by limitation. Flavoring the feast. The medieval palate craved flavor, but spices were costly, so creativity bloomed. Locally, people used mustard seed, horseradish, garlic, dill, fennel, parsley, mint, sage, thyme, and rosemary. Vinegar and verjuice, sour grape juice, added tang. Salt, when available, preserved and enhanced. In noble kitchens, spices like cinnamon, ginger, saffron, and cloves traveled from the east along the Silk Road. These were exotic, expensive, and used in strange ways. Cinnamon in meat stews, sugar with fish, or cloves in wine. But for most, it was the wild herbs of hedgerows that made food sing. Bread, ale, and the daily table. Let us return to the peasant household now, just before sunrise. In the soft amber glow of dawn, a woman kneads dough by the warmth of the hearth. Bread, the most constant presence on the medieval table. But not all bread was the same. Oh no, its color, texture, and taste told you exactly who you were. Bread, the loaf of life. In the Middle Ages, bread was a mirror of social class. The poor ate coarse, heavy loaves made from rye, barley, or oats, dense, sour, and sometimes gritty from stone-ground flour. The wealthy feasted on fine white wheat bread, called manchet, light, fluffy, and highly prized. There was also maslin, a mix of grains, often wheat and rye. Bakers used sourdough starters or ale barm foam from brewing as natural leavening. In manors and abbeys, communal ovens baked dozens of loaves at once. For peasants, they sometimes shared a village oven or baked in the hearth's embers, leaving a smoky flavor. Bread was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It was bowl and spoon, napkin and plate. Even trenchers, thick slices of bread, served as edible plates for meals in the noble hall. Ale, the safer drink. Now, beside the bread, another constant companion, ale. Yes, in the Middle Ages, water wasn't always safe. Rivers and wells could be contaminated. Ale, even weakly brewed, was boiled and thus safer. Children drank small ale, low in alcohol and rich in calories. Brewing was often a household chore, done by women called alewives. Every home had its brewing pots, wooden tubs, and barrels. A simple mix of barley, water, and yeast, no hops yet in early medieval times. Some added herbs like bog myrtle or yarrow for flavor. In manors and inns, ale flowed daily, foaming and warm from oak casks. Meals, rhythm of the day. Meals followed the sun and the labor of the land. Breakfast was simple, a crust of bread, a sip of ale, maybe cheese or onion. Dinner, the main meal, came around midday. For the peasant, pottage, bread, maybe beans or fish if lucky. Supper was lighter, perhaps more bread, a stew's leftover, or a slice of cold porridge. Meals were eaten together, often from shared bowls. Spoons and fingers were common. Knives were personal. Each person carried their own. Plates were rare, and manners were based more on practicality than polish. Cheese and butter, the cream of the crop. Milk had to be consumed quickly or preserved. So cheese and butter were daily blessings. Cows, goats, and sheep provided milk. Butter was churned by hand, a long, rhythmic task. Cheese was made in all textures, fresh soft curds or hard wheels aged in cool cellars. Salted and smoked, some cheeses lasted through harsh winters. Butter and cheese gave richness to dull meals, calories to tired workers, and joy to hungry children. The flavors were sharp, tangy, earthy, and deeply local. Soups, stews, and the magical medieval pottage. Now, back to the peasant kitchen. The hearth is glowing. A cauldron hangs over the fire, bubbling gently. Steam rises, carrying a scent not of spice and roast, but of barley, leeks, and onions. Tonight's supper is simple, yes, but hearty. A spoonful of history, pottage. What was pottage? Pottage was the lifeblood of medieval cooking. A stew of whatever was at hand, grains, pulses, roots, herbs. Cooked low and slow, all day, it thickened as it boiled. The base? Barley or oats. Into the pot went onions, cabbage, garlic, sometimes beans or peas. Maybe a splash of ale. Maybe a bone or two if the family had meat to spare. If meat wasn't available, and it often wasn't, flavor came from herbs. Parsley, sage, wild sorrel. It could be thin like broth, or thick enough to eat with a fork carved from wood. This was no restaurant fare, but it warmed the belly after a day in the fields. The taste? Earthy, mild, rooted in the rhythm of the land. Some pottages were sweet, made with milk, honey, dried fruits. Others were savory and garlicky, heavy with wild leeks or mustard greens. Families might stretch a single stew over several days, adding water and more ingredients as it shrank. It was called perpetual stew by some, always simmering, always ready. When there was meat. And now, the rare day when meat found its way into the pot. A chicken, perhaps, from the backyard coop. A bit of bacon saved for a holy day. In wealthier homes, lamb, beef, or venison. Meat was precious, not everyday fare. It was reserved for feast days, weddings, harvest celebrations. When it was used, nothing was wasted. Every bone, organ, and scrap went into the pot, boiled, stewed, or roasted on open fire. Seasoned with salt if you had it, or aged cheese rinds, or onions, or mustard seeds. Foraging, nature's pantry. The fields and forests were part of the larder too. In spring, peasants gathered wild garlic, watercress, and nettles. In summer, there were berries, hazelnuts, mushrooms, and rose hips. Caution was needed. Some mushrooms were deadly, others delicious. Foragers passed knowledge down through generations. Children learned which herbs to pick and which to avoid. The taste of wild greens was sharp and bright, a contrast to the earthy stew. Now, let us turn to something even more sacred than soup. The food of the poor and the nobility alike. The one thing that graced nearly every table, be it a peasant's bench or a noble's board. Bread, not just a food, but a ritual. The act of baking, of kneading, rising, and baking was part of the heartbeat of medieval life. For most villagers, bread was made from rye, barley, or oats. Wheat was a luxury. The loaves were dense, dark, and slightly sour. Not like today's fluffy bread. Sometimes gritty, bits of bran, or even stone dust from the grinding stones. Yet, still comforting. Shared among family, passed to guests, given to beggars. Bread was more than nourishment. It was a symbol of hospitality. And then there were the trenchers, not plates, but thick slices of stale bread. Food was served upon them. Meats and sauces soaked the bread until soft and savory. The wealthy tossed them to the dogs or gave them to the poor. The poor ate them with gratitude. For the monks and nuns, bread was baked in great ovens at the abbey, sometimes laced with herbs or sweetened with honey. Even a monastery's silence was filled with the sin of baking bread. Monks would grind their own flour, feed the fire with logs, and turn the loaves with care. Ale, the drink of the masses. Now imagine a tankard. Wooden, heavy, worn smooth by time. Inside, warm, slightly cloudy ale. Brewed not by corporations or factories, but by mothers. Women were the brewers of the medieval village. Known as alewives, ale was brewed at home, in small batches, often weak and nourishing. Water wasn't always safe, but ale, boiled and fermented, was a safer option. Even children drank small ale, a low-alcohol version that wouldn't dull the senses. The ingredients? Barley, water, yeast, and if you had it, a touch of honey or herbs. Stronger ale, spiced with juniper or hops, was made for special occasions. Ale wasn't just a beverage, it was a community bond, shared at markets, after harvests, at weddings and funerals. It sang of the soil, the season, and the hands that brewed it. Cooking tools, primitive but practical. In a medieval kitchen, tools were few, but every item told a story. The iron pot was prized, passed through generations, seasoned with every stew. Wooden spoons, clay bowls, woven baskets, and iron knives were common. Griddles for flatbreads, spits for turning meat, and heavy mortars for grinding spices. Herbs and grains were crushed with care, sometimes with stones on a slab. Cooking was slow, methodical, and deliberate, an art shaped by limitation. From garden to hearth, herbs, vegetables, and the subtle flavors of daily life. Now, dear listener, let us leave the warm hearth for a gentle walk outside, into the garden, where the real magic grows quietly in the earth. The medieval kitchen garden, a patchwork of flavor, medicine, and prayer. It may not seem like much, but it was where life bloomed, literally and otherwise. For most villagers, meat was rare. But the garden gave daily gifts: onions, leeks, and garlic, staples of stews and broths; cabbages, boiled, pickled, and sometimes fermented; turnips, parsnips, and carrots, not always orange, mind you, but white, purple, or yellow; earthy, robust, reliable. And then there were herbs. Oh, the herbs. Sage for strength, rosemary for memory, thyme for courage, parsley to cleanse the breath. They flavored soups, warded off evil, and lined the cradles of the sick, grown with love and whispered blessings. Even flowers had a place in the pot: marigolds, violets, elderflowers, not just for beauty but for subtle flavor; a handful in honey cakes, a sprinkle in wine, a petal in stew. The medieval kitchen, you see, was not loud with spice, but soft-spoken with fragrance. The cooking of a quiet day. Imagine a pot suspended over a fire. Inside, pottage. The eternal medieval dish. Not quite soup, not quite stew. A blend of whatever was available: barley, beans, herbs, maybe a root vegetable or two. If fortune smiled, a bit of bacon or marrowbone. If not, thickened with oats or stale bread. Bubbling all day long, thickening slowly as the sun crossed the sky. Children learned from mothers which berries to eat, which mushrooms to fear. And when spring arrived, wild garlic sprouted like green fire through the underbrush. It made the whole village smell like stew and hope. These were not fancy meals, but they were full of earth, full of care, full of patience, like the seasons themselves. And they tasted not just of salt or sweetness, but of place, of time, of being home. And so we drift quietly now into the rustic kitchens of the peasant cottages. Imagine, if you will, the wooden beams above your head, low and weathered from decades of smoke curling up from the hearth below. The walls are packed with straw and mud, imperfect but warm. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke, roasted barley, and the faint sweetness of drying herbs that hang from the rafters. In one corner of this cozy space, a clay jug rests upon a roughly hewn shelf, filled with small beer, not the strong, sharp ale of nobles, but a gentle brew, mild enough for even the children to drink. Water was not always clean, and so even peasants would boil it and ferment it slightly. The result? A cloudy, barely bitter beverage that served as the daily drink, poured into carved wooden cups with simple designs. Next to it, a large iron cauldron hangs over the hearth, gently bubbling. Inside, a stew, a humble masterpiece. Cabbage, beans, and perhaps a few precious shreds of salt pork, if the family was lucky. The stew never truly finished. It evolved day by day, with scraps added whenever they were available. The flavor deepened slowly, like the turning pages of an old, familiar book. Children helped gather greens from the hedgerows, nettles, dandelions, and chickweed, each one adding its own earthy tone to the meal. No spices from far lands here. The flavor was simple, even bland, but comforting, familiar, the warmth of survival. And as the pot simmered, flatbreads were slapped onto hot stones beside the fire. Coarse barley loaves, dense and nutty, made without yeast. The smell, yeasty, slightly burnt, hearty, filled the room with a sleepy sort of peace. Sometimes, on feast days or harvest festivals, a pottage of oats might be sweetened with a spoonful of precious honey. A moment of sweetness in a world of effort. And above all, the quiet. No hum of machines, no clatter of metal pans, just the steady crackle of firewood, the soft sound of bubbling stew. The sun had long since passed its peak, and the village stirred with the drowsy energy of the afternoon. In the quiet of a stone kitchen, the gentle clinking of ceramic lids being lifted and replaced echoed softly. Bread dough, set to rise near the warm hearth, had doubled in size, a soft dome ready for baking. The peasants weren't the only ones who took bread seriously. In the manor house, the steward oversaw a more elaborate bake, a sweet bread, laced with dried fruits and spiced with a pinch of cinnamon, rare and costly. It would be served during supper, perhaps alongside a honeyed wine and a story shared by candlelight. Elsewhere in the village, someone was churning butter. It was a quiet, rhythmic task. A small barrel-shaped churn rocked back and forth, the cream within thickening with each patient movement. Butter was gold in the village. It enriched pottages, greased pans, and occasionally served as an offering to the church. Evening drew closer, and the smells of dinner drifted through open shutters and crooked doorways. Roasting onions, boiling barley, and the sharp tang of pickled vegetables. On feast days, the smells would be grander: roasted lamb, fresh herbs, perhaps even garlic if fortune had smiled that season. But today was no feast. Today was a meal like any other, meant to nourish and quiet the hunger that rose like clockwork in every belly. And as the stars began their silent dance across the night sky, the villagers sat, tired, content, and full. A crust of bread, a ladle of stew, a sip of ale. It was enough. For them, food was not a performance. It was not presented on silver trays with garnishes of glittering herbs. It was humble, shared, and rooted in the rhythm of the land. Late afternoon settles over the village like a woolen blanket, muting every sound but the gentle thrum of sparrows in the eaves. Inside the main cottage, work slows to a contented hush. The great iron cauldron, which has simmered for hours, releases a final, fragrant sigh of barley, leeks, and wild garlic before the fire is raked low. Beside it, a round of coarse rye dough has risen beneath a linen cloth. Its surface is cracked with small valleys of flour, proof of the warm breath of yeast. In one practiced sweep, the cook lifts the dough, pats it into a rough circle, and slides it onto a hot slab of stone set near the embers. A hiss, a faint waft of nutty aroma, and then only patient waiting while twilight presses its cool fingers against the shutters. Across the lane, the smithy's wife prepares her family's supper in a smaller hearth. She tips yesterday's pottage, now thick as porridge, into a clay bowl, then stirs in fresh nettle tops clipped at dawn. The deep green flecks swirl through the creamy mixture, promising a whisper of spring in every bite. She slices a single onion, its layers translucent in the fire glow, and drops them in, letting their sweetness soften the edge of the wild greens. A thumb-sized piece of salt pork follows, precious, smoky, and fatty, enough to perfume the entire dish. There will be no more meat until the next market day, but tonight, this is feast enough. Outside, the kitchen garden rests after a long day of sun. Carrot tops stand in neat rows, bushy and fragrant, while the broad leaves of young cabbages curl inward like cloaks against the coming night chill. A gangly kitchen boy gathers beet greens in his arms, feet bare on the earthen path. He hums a tune he heard in the alehouse, soft, lilting, and half-remembered, while fireflies blink awake among the pea vines. He pauses to sniff a sprig of rosemary, tucks it behind his ear, and heads indoors where lamplight flickers. Back in the cottage, the newly baked rye loaf emerges crackle-skinned and steaming. The cook splits it with a dull iron knife, revealing a dense, dark crumb that smells of earth and hearth smoke. She ladles a portion of stew into 2 wooden bowls, sets half the loaf between them, and calls her children from their straw pallets. They settle on a bench in the hush, dipping hunks of bread into broth too hot to eat quickly, sipping carefully so as not to waste a single drop. Outside, The first stars kindle over the black silhouettes of thatched roofs. Farther down the road, the village innkeeper taps a small ale barrel, letting the first foamy stream fill a clay mug. His dog circles 3 times beside the hearth before settling with a sigh. A lone traveler, dusty from the road, trades a story for a heel of bread and a warm seat by the fire. He speaks of a distant fair where figs were sold 3 for a penny, an unimaginable luxury here, while the innkeeper listens, wiping foam from the rim with the back of his hand, content that another night has safely come. The sky over the medieval village was heavy with a sleepy gray, the kind of sky that made time feel slow, like honey dripping from a wooden spoon. Roosters had long announced the day, but the sun remained shy, casting a soft, silvery light over the thatched rooftops. Today was the feast day of Saint Swithin, and that meant no labor in the fields, no taxes collected, and most importantly, an excuse to bake something sweet, even if sweetness was just a pinch of dried berries in a barley loaf. Matilda, an elderly woman with hands as weathered as river stones, stood at her fire pit inside her one-room cottage. She stirred a thin porridge slowly, mumbling under her breath as she added wild herbs for flavor. Her breath puffed in the cold air like smoke, and the fire crackled softly, warming the small space. Behind her, 2 chickens clucked lazily in a woven basket, waiting for scraps. Her cat, a black ball of fur named Pippin, slept curled on the worn straw mattress near the hearth. Outside, the village came alive in its slow, familiar rhythm. Children, too young to be useful and too old to sit still, chased each other around muddy puddles, laughing with joy that even winter's chill couldn't dull. A dog with one ear flopped over, called Harold by everyone, trotted after them, his tongue lolling in happiness. Further down the lane, a cooper hammered a wooden ring around a barrel, the sound ringing like a heartbeat through the village center. Smoke curled from the chimneys of homes, mixing into a soft haze above the rooftops. The air smelled of damp moss, smoke, and a hint of freshly baked rye bread coming from the communal oven. The village baker, an enormous man with flour permanently crusted into the folds of his apron, was already shouting at a boy who had tried to sneak an early piece. The church bell rang, one solid gong, and the villagers paused. It wasn't a call to work or prayer, just a ritual reminder. This was a day of rest. The priest, a kindly figure with patched robes and a crooked smile, wandered the lanes with a sprig of lavender in his hand. He greeted people by name, blessed their animals, and offered them prayers that they hoped would bring better harvests or at least keep the wolves away. A spinner sat on a low stool beneath an awning, her spindle twirling like a whisper. She was always there, rain or shine, spinning stories into wool, humming songs from her childhood. Her daughter helped by carding wool beside her, watching every movement as if it were sacred. As the sun dipped lower beyond the timbered rooftops of medieval towns, an aroma unlike any other wafted from the home of a wealthy merchant. Here, in stark contrast to the rustic peasant table or the solemn fare of the monastery, the kitchen held wonders not native to these northern lands. A stew, bubbling softly in an iron cauldron, had been transformed not by fresh produce or tender meats, but by spices so rare they arrived with armed escorts and merchant seals. A single pinch of saffron could equal a day's wages. A twist of black pepper might impress nobility. Welcome now, dear dreamer, to the fragrant world of spices and medieval trade, and their curious role in cooking and power. Salt was the foundation of all preservation, more valuable in some regions than gold. Entire villages along riverways existed to mine, boil, or refine salt, which, once dried and stored, allowed meat to last beyond seasons. Without salt, there could be no pickled herrings, no smoked ham tucked into lard crocks, no butter stored in brine. Medieval kitchens measured wealth by how heavily they could salt. Some nobles salted not only for function but for display, an extravagance to boast of their means. Whole legs of meat were packed in layered salt boxes, dried slowly by kitchen fires for months, only to be unwrapped during feasts in grand halls. In markets across Europe, spice traders mingled with bakers, butchers, and cloth merchants. The most precious spices, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, journeyed from the east through perilous desert caravans and stormy sea voyages. They were often stored under lock and key in tiny wooden boxes, passed carefully from hand to hand. Their presence in a dish elevated it, symbolically and practically, into elite territory. Recipes written in the scrolls of noble kitchens used phrases like a touch of paradise seed or the breath of the Indies. They believed spices warmed the blood, balanced the humors, and protected against the miasmas of illness. But how did they taste, these storied ingredients? For the noble classes, spices transformed the mundane. Roast beef was dusted with cinnamon and cloves. Fish might be bathed in vinegar and pepper sauce. Dried fruits stewed in wine became puddings redolent of nutmeg and ginger. For peasants, if they ever got a whiff, it was a once-a-year wonder, perhaps tasted at a fair or seen as a gift during church festivals. Most likely, their only spice was the wild mustard or garlic grown behind their hut. Yet the stories they heard, whispered between spoonfuls of porridge, made spices mythical, flavors from the lands where dragons might dwell. Spices were more than flavor, they were power. Monarchs granted monopolies over spice routes. Wars were fought for ports that received pepper, and ships laden with cloves and nutmeg were treated like royal treasure. These goods spurred exploration and mapped the world, but in medieval kitchens, they simply made boiled turnips taste extraordinary. For scribes and scholars of the day, food was part medicine, part mystery. Recipes were often guarded secrets, passed down only within families or monastic orders. A monk might pin down a formula for spiced wine between prayers, believing it healed not only the body, but the soul. Thus, as we close this part of our journey, let us sit once more at the long table of medieval life. The scent of cloves swirls in the air, and the stew, though humble, sings with foreign notes. Spices, for those who held them, were a connection to something larger, to distant lands, to divine healing, and to fleeting luxuries. And for you, gentle listener, they add another thread to this tapestry, soft, warm, and fragrant, lulling you deeper into sleep. Outside, across the muddy lanes of a bustling market town, bakers sold fragrant loaves of black bread, dark, dense, and flecked with oat or rye. The wealthy could afford lighter wheat bread, called wastel bread, soft and white, a luxury few peasants would ever taste. These loaves were often sliced and used as edible trenchers, plates that soaked up sauces and juices, and were either eaten at the end of a meal or given to the poor. Bread wasn't just food, it was status. Meanwhile, monasteries were quietly revolutionizing the culinary traditions of the time. Monks, skilled in record-keeping and agriculture, began to refine the art of brewing and baking. Their meager monastic diets, rooted in simplicity, nonetheless produced some of the finest breads in Alish. Ale, in particular, was central to medieval life. Weak in alcohol and brewed with herbs like gruit before hops became common, it was often safer than water and consumed daily by children and adults alike. In some villages, even breakfast for farm workers included bread soaked in ale. And yet, not all was warm and pleasant. Food scarcity was never far away. A poor harvest meant lean months ahead, and in those times, the meals grew thinner, more gruel than stew, more hope than flavor. Still, they found ways to persevere. Acorns were ground into bitter flour, wheats became greens, and dried fish soaked in vinegar made a rare protein-rich feast when meat was too costly. Even the act of eating reflected hierarchy. In noble halls, meals were events. Diners washed hands with scented water before sitting at long trestle tables. Courses were paraded in, roasted swans in full feather, pies with hidden surprises, candied fruits from distant lands. Meanwhile, servants ate in the kitchens, hunched on stools, sipping leftovers from ladles between chores. But rich or poor, food was community. It brought people together during feasts, fairs, and famine alike. From harvest festivals where loaves were blessed and shared, to days when, as the golden hue of afternoon sun filtered through the narrow windows of a bustling medieval tavern, the mingling scent of roasted garlic, simmering broth, and warm ale filled the air like a comforting, savory fog. Within the low-ceilinged timber halls, peasants and merchants huddled on rough-hewn benches, their wooden bowls brimming with steaming pottage. A simple stew thickened with lentils, barley, or bits of turnip and cabbage. One could hear the dull clink of wooden spoons against bowls, the occasional hearty chuckle, and the low murmur of conversation that ebbed and flowed like the tide. Meals like these were more than just sustenance. For many, especially the poor, food was ritual. The pottage, for instance, was a staple in nearly every household across medieval Europe. It varied wildly depending on the region and the season, sometimes flavored with onions or wild herbs, other times enriched with marrow bones if the butcher was generous. It was the embodiment of medieval resourcefulness. A pot would be kept on the fire, continually replenished throughout the week, each day's additions changing its texture and taste, transforming it into a living, evolving dish. In a rural village, the scene would shift to a family gathered around the hearth. A mother, sleeves rolled to her elbows, stirred the day's meal in a cauldron hung over an open fire. Her eldest daughter crushed dried herbs, parsley, sage, maybe even a bit of mugwort, between her fingers before sprinkling them into the pot. These herbs were more than flavor. They held the folklore of health and healing, passed down by generations. Behind her, a toddler gnawed happily on a coarse slice of rye bread, tough from 2 days' storage but softened in the heat of the hearth. Feasting, fasting, and the rhythms of the medieval table. As twilight settled across the rolling hills of the countryside, casting a lavender hue upon the fields and forests, the rhythm of medieval life shifted once again from toil to rest and from scarcity to shared ritual. In this tranquil hour, one might hear the echo of church bells marking vespers, a gentle chime that reminded every soul, noble and peasant alike, that it was time for reflection and often a humble evening meal. This part of the day was when medieval households, regardless of rank, gathered at the hearth for warmth and sustenance. And while daily meals were often modest, there were times throughout the year when the tables groaned under the weight of true celebration, feasts so grand, so deliberate, that they became moments etched in memory for generations. Let us wander now, softly, into one such scene, a village celebrating the end of harvest. The feast begins with a blessing, the priest lifting his hands toward the stars, giving thanks for the grain safely stored and the fruits of the land. The villagers respond with bowed heads and quiet gratitude. Then the real celebration begins. Roasted meats, rare and treasured, are carried in on great wooden platters. The scent of honey-glazed pork and spiced lamb rises into the cool evening air. There are jugs of ale passed hand to hand, and sweet apple tarts baked in clay ovens. Children nibble at boiled chestnuts and berries, while elders share tales of hard winters and bountiful springs. Yet, in the monasteries and noble courts, feasts take on a different character, ornate, symbolic, and regulated by strict etiquette. In the castle of a minor lord, A banquet might be held in honor of a visiting baron. In the stone hall, banners flutter and candles flicker against the rush-covered floors. Here, the feast is structured in removes or courses. A remove of roasted game might be followed by fish, then custards and stewed fruits. Between courses, entertainers perform, jesters tumble, minstrels pluck melodies from their lyres, and troubadours sing of courtly love and heroic battles. Each dish is not only nourishment, but a performance. A pie might conceal live birds, fluttering upward in surprise when cut. A roasted boar might be presented with an apple in its mouth and gilded hoofs. And at the head of the table, the Lord lifts his goblet in solemnity, his gesture marking the start of each course. Contrast this with the rules of fasting. The Church, ever a guiding hand in medieval life, dictated days when meat was forbidden. On such days, fish became the substitute for the wealthy, while peasants turned to vegetables, legumes, and black bread dipped in vinegar. But even fasting was a layered practice. The wealthy, ever resourceful, found ways to make fasting luxurious. On fish days, their tables overflowed with exotic fish, crustaceans, and rich sauces. Eels, considered both fish and a delicacy, appeared often in upper-class kitchens. Sometimes these dishes were sculpted to resemble meat, just in case any guest was tempted to mourn its absence. For the poor, however, fasting was often indistinguishable from everyday life. Meat was already rare. Fish might be salted herring or dried eel, soaked in water to soften its leathery texture. And when even that was beyond reach, they turned to leeks, peas, and barley pottage again, the dependable comfort of simple food. The year's calendar moved from feast to fast with predictable rhythm. Religious festivals, Christmas, Easter, and Saints' Days were occasions of celebration, each marked by regional dishes, blessed loaves, and holy feasts. Yet every Sunday, too, was special. Families might bake a better loaf or prepare a sweet treat of honey and nuts just to honor the Sabbath. But perhaps the most remarkable element of all was how food was shared. At many noble feasts, a portion was set aside for the poor. In village churches, alms loaves were distributed after Massachusetts. Even during famine, neighbors looked after one another, sharing onions, scraps of cheese, or herbs plucked from the common hedgerows. Brewing, boiling, and baking, the everyday arts of medieval cooking. The quiet morning mist curls over the thatched rooftops of the village, slipping like a wisp of memory through the chimneys and open shutters. Inside a modest timber-framed cottage, the air is rich with the scent of boiling grains and damp earth, while a low fire crackles in a wide, soot-darkened hearth. Here, in the belly of every medieval home, whether humble or grand, was the hearth, the beating heart of sustenance, warmth, and survival. It is at this simple center that the rhythms of cooking played out, day after day, season after season. Let us now take a long, cozy walk through the medieval kitchen, where pots bubble, loaves rise, and secrets of the age-old recipes are whispered through steam. In a peasant's dwelling, the kitchen was often indistinct from the rest of the home. There were no counters, no cupboards, and certainly no gleaming pans. Instead, there were wooden bowls, clay pots, a few iron implements, and a suspended cauldron, forever simmering with some form of stew. These pottages were the daily fare of the common folk, thickened with barley or oats, flavored with onions, leeks, cabbage, and occasionally, if luck smiled, a scrap of bacon or a marrow bone. The longer the pot simmered, the more the flavors deepened. Sometimes the stew would bubble for days, replenished each evening with whatever ingredients were at hand. It was a living broth, changing with each ladleful, nourishing through repetition, comforting in its predictability. Baking, though more occasional, held a sacred space in the medieval week. Most peasants did not own ovens. Instead, they would knead dough at home and take it to the communal village bakehouse, where the baker, often employed by the lord of the manor, tended the hot stone oven. Bread came in many forms and qualities, from coarse black rye loaves to lighter wheat bread reserved for those with coin to spare. The trencher, a stale slice of bread used as a plate, absorbed sauces and meats and was often fed to dogs or the poor afterward, having served both culinary and charitable purposes. On feast days, spices were sometimes added, cinnamon, if one were lucky, or perhaps cloves brought from afar. These were tokens of far-off lands, ground into the dough like whispers of exotic wonders. Boiling, roasting, and even frying were practiced in the homes of wealthier villagers and, of course, in manor houses. In noble kitchens, the work was divided amongst many. Spitboys turned meat over open flames, scullions scrubbed pots and chopped herbs, and cooks, half scientist, half magician, prepared elaborate concoctions for the gentry. They made jellies that trembled like glass, molded pastries into the shapes of birds or castles, and constructed towering desserts that glimmered with sugar, then an extravagance almost more precious than gold. And what of drinks? While clean water could be found from springs or wells, it was often suspect in densely populated areas. Ale was the preferred drink of most, mild, nourishing, and brewed locally. Even children drank it, though theirs was a weaker version called small beer. Women often brewed ale at home, making them the original alewives. They balanced the mixture of malted barley, water, and herbs with practiced ease, pouring it into barrels to ferment in cool corners of their cottages. Monasteries, too, brewed beer, rich, hearty, and perfect for fasting days. Dining customs and table manners, the rituals around medieval meals. Let us now drift into the rhythms of mealtime itself, a slow and sacred affair in the medieval world, far removed from the haste and clatter of modern dining. Picture, if you will, the late afternoon sun casting golden beams through the narrow windows of a wooden hall, warming the rough-hewn benches and the oaken table at the center of the room. A meal was not just nourishment. It was ceremony, community, and, for many, the high point of the day. From peasant cottages to noble banquets, the act of eating carried with it a deep sense of structure, hierarchy, and meaning. In the common village home, the meal began with a simple gesture, washing one's hands. A basin of clean water might be brought around, and though soap was rare, scrubbing away the dirt of fieldwork was essential. There were no forks. Most ate with spoons or fingers, and bread served as both food and tool. The family would gather on low stools or benches around a heavy table, or in some cases, eat while seated on the floor with bowls in hand. The table was laid with coarse linen, if any, and wooden trenchers, flat slabs of stale bread or simple wood, served as plates. Bowls were passed, not individually portioned, a hearty stew, a slice of rough bread, perhaps a bit of cheese or an onion. Everyone shared what was available, and nothing went to waste. Meals were often governed by the rules of the church, which structured the calendar with fasts, feasts, and abstinences. Wednesdays, Fridays, and Lent brought restrictions. No meat, and in some stricter homes, no dairy. Fish became the favored substitute, fresh, salted, or dried, though peasants far from rivers or the sea rarely had access to it. During these times, legumes, grains, and vegetables took center stage, and creative cooking methods gave variety to otherwise repetitive fare. On feast days, however, the table became a place of joy and abundance. A goose or a pig might be roasted. The sweet and the strange, treats, flavors, and forgotten dishes. There is something curiously delightful about exploring the forgotten flavors of the past, especially the little treats that brighten long days of toil and hardship. Let us now wander, slowly and warmly, into the lesser-known corners of the medieval pantry. You see, while most daily meals were plain, practical, and repetitive, there existed special moments, market day, feast day, weddings, the return of a long-lost traveler, when something sweet or strange was brought to the table. It may have been a dish saved up for months, or a surprise tucked away by a careful housewife. Either way, the delight of these rare indulgences was magnified by their rarity, and even the humblest pie could feel like a royal delicacy. Start with honey, the king of medieval sweeteners. Before the arrival of sugar through trade routes from the East, honey was the go-to for satisfying a sweet tooth. Beekeeping was a respected art, and many households kept hives not just for the honey, but also for beeswax, used in candles. Honey would be stirred into porridge, drizzled on fruit, or baked into rough little cakes made from oats and groundnuts. Children might sneak a fingerful when no one was looking, and a spoonful of honey was often given to the sick, both as comfort and medicine. In monastic kitchens, honey was revered, used carefully and sparingly, a golden thread in the fabric of fasting and feasting alike. Sugar eventually made its slow and expensive journey into Europe. At first, it was treated like a spice, rare, precious, and used medicinally. Apothecaries sold sugar as a cure for various ailments, and it was locked away in the storerooms of castles and wealthy homes. Only the nobility could afford to use it in cooking, and even then, it was used in tiny pinches, sprinkled over roasted almonds or fruit, or blended into sauces for meat in a mix of sweet and savory that might surprise the modern palate. Imagine a tender roast pork served with a glaze of honey, vinegar, and prunes, or a chicken stew with saffron, cinnamon, and sugar all together. Strange to our taste today, but in medieval times, the blending of sweet, sour, and spicy was seen as the height of sophistication. As we wander farther into the world of medieval kitchens and feasting halls, we cannot help but notice the sweet scents that linger not only in the air, but in the stories told by cooks, traders, and travelers. Sugar, rare as gold and guarded like treasure, was used not merely to sweeten, but to dazzle. For those fortunate enough to afford it, sugar became art. In royal courts, it was molded into sculptures of animals, castles, and even entire battle scenes. These confections, known as subtleties, were served between courses at grand feasts, astonishing guests not just with taste but with spectacle. Imagine a lion carved from sugar, paw poised mid-roar, or a miniature castle with candied windows and walls that shimmered in torchlight. These were not just desserts. They were messages of wealth, power, and creativity. The peasants, of course, could only dream of such marvels. Their relationship with sweetness came through nature, from honey harvested from hives kept in woven skeps near the garden or found wild in forests. These were more than just honey makers. They were signs of fortune, and their hives were often tended with reverence. Honey was used in mead, in preserving fruits, and sometimes even in brewing crude vinegar or medicinal mixtures. Still, for a peasant child, a rare treat of oat cakes drizzled with warm honey or berries dipped into a bit of sweetened milk could feel like a festival in the mouth, a break from the constant monotony of porridge and broth. Inside the manor house or noble kitchen, however, sugar's appearance sparked creativity. Scribes recorded recipes for pies of Paris and tartes and aplis, which might include layers of fruit, wine, spices, and yes, if one had the coin, a bit of sugar. The cook might beat eggs for custards thickened gently over coals, adding saffron for color and sugar for sweetness. A cook's reputation could rise or fall based on their hand with such dishes, and among servants, there were whispered rivalries and jealousies. One had once heard of a cook dismissed for burning the sugar loaf, blackening it into an expensive ruin. Another was praised for layering a tart with almond cream and sugared figs so skillfully that the Lord himself requested it thrice in a week. Sugar also had its place in medicine. Monasteries recorded the use of candied herbs and sugar syrups as treatments for coughs, melancholy, and fatigue. Syrups of violets or rose petals were stored in glass flasks and used in tiny amounts by monks who doubled as apothecaries. The mixing of medicine and cuisine was not unusual in the Middle Ages. What we today might think of as dessert was once considered tonic. This mingling of food and healing gave sweets an elevated purpose. A spoonful of sugar, indeed, was not simply pleasure, but prescription. Travelers along trade routes, particularly the Silk Road and Mediterranean lanes, helped carry sugar from the Arab world into Europe. They brought stories of sugarcane plantations in the East, of boiling houses and refining techniques that allowed the raw cane to become glittering crystals. Venetian merchants grew rich through such imports, and their ships returning from the Levant often carried sugar loaves wrapped carefully to avoid melting or contamination. The spice markets of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa began to stock sugar alongside cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg. Let us now step into the smoky heart of a medieval village, the kitchen hearth, the domain of flavor, fire, and occasional minor explosions. Here, in the soft, flickering glow of a wood fire, our good Lady Matilda stirred an iron pot with the sort of intensity usually reserved for sacred rituals or boiling witches. Steam curled upward like mischievous spirits, releasing the faint aroma of onions, turnips, barley, and a faint hint of, "Was that yesterday's sock?" "It adds depth," Matilda would say solemnly, refusing to explain. In these stone-walled kitchens, cooking was less about recipe and more about resilience. With no timers, no precise measurements, and certainly no salt unless your cousin had returned from the Crusades with a pouch of contraband seasoning, food was a creative gamble. Over the hearth, an iron hook held a kettle that had survived 3 generations and at least 2 house fires. "Stir clockwise or the spirits get angry," Gerard muttered as he passed through, entirely serious. Evenings around the fire were moments of storytelling and silent chewing. Every now and then, someone bit down on a pebble hiding in the porridge and cursed the ancestors, but that was all part of the charm. When taste wasn't the main event, texture and survival took center stage. The morning sun had scarcely risen when the clanging sound of iron pots and the murmur of sleepy yawns filled the thatched cottage kitchens of a medieval village. The scent of barley porridge, thick and clumpy, drifted through the smoke-stained beams of the low ceiling, swirling in the heavy air like an invisible fog of comfort. A housewife, her linen coif drooping from the weight of sleep still clinging to her, stirred a heavy iron pot hanging over an open hearth. The porridge had been simmering all night, absorbing the smokiness of the fire and the flavor of every scrap of herb, root, or stale bread crust added to stretch it out. It was the sort of breakfast that stuck to your ribs and your memory because it never quite changed. She ladled the mush into wooden bowls, placing one before each yawning family member. Her youngest son prodded the porridge with a carved spoon, watching it wobble back in silent defiance. With a shrug of resignation and a sleepy grunt, he took a bite, wincing slightly at the texture. It was warm, yes. It was filling, certainly. But taste? That was an afterthought. A pinch of salt, if you were lucky, or a smear of last year's jam might elevate it. Most days, though, the porridge was just porridge. But it was dependable, and that counted for something. On especially good days, there might be a little surprise added to breakfast, some sour ale left over from the night before. Not the kind of ale that made minstrels dance on tables, but the weak, low-alcohol version brewed in every cottage that doubled as both beverage and mouthwash. Children drank it, elders swore by it, and everyone accepted it with the same tired nod as they did the porridge. The ale had a sharp tang that could wake the dead, or at least the chickens out back. Brewed from barley, sometimes oats, and fermented in open barrels with wild yeasts, it often fizzled with mystery. Every batch was different. Some were sour, some were flat, and some were, quite frankly, suspicious. Despite its reputation, the ale played an important role. Water wasn't always safe, especially near the village dung heap, and the brewing process made ale a far safer option. So even if it tasted like something scraped off the underside of a wagon, it was better than dysentery. Many families brewed their own, tweaking the recipe with herbs like yarrow or horehound, adding not just flavor but a hint of medicinal bravado. And sometimes, on feast days, they'd splash a bit of honey in to fool themselves into thinking it was something fancier. And then came the cheese, the mysterious, often alarming cheese, made from sheep or goat milk, depending on what was wandering the yard that month. The cheese was a product of both skill and sheer hope. It was wrapped in cloth and set near the fire or in the window to age, or at least to survive long enough to be called cheese. The final product could be anything from creamy and delightful to so hard you could chip a tooth or summon a ghost. Still, it was rich in fats and protein, and the villagers treasured it like gold. They might pair it with coarse bread, perhaps dipped in weak ale, and call it a breakfast of champions. Champions of questionable digestive outcomes, but champions nonetheless. Please subscribe and comment for next part.